We surely return back to this issue later on, because the public must know the details of what you had just said. But for the moment, let's go to a highly incendiary topic. When you spoke in our first interview about the origins of Romanian language and Romanian people, I believe it was in part 3, the last minutes, and I'd like to explain us what is the origins of the Romanian and Latin languages, beginning with what had been found about the past 15,000 years when the last glacial era had ended.
Yeah, as we all know, languages are grouped in families, and we have the custom to speak of the Latin family of languages. The Latin languages are obviously Italian, which descends directly from Latin, but actually, say, modern Spanish is, I was amazed because I wasn't acquainted with Spanish until I had already spent 5 or 6 years learning Latin. But I was amazed at the degree to which Spanish resembles Latin. It's closer to classical Latin than the Italian language, which descends directly from Latin, is. But then, of course, we know that there, in addition to Italian and Spanish, the Romanian language is quite correctly grouped as a Latin language. But as, over the course of my life's work, I began to realize that this actually is not, it's not that Romanian is a Latin language, because Romanian is from where Latin came. And of course, we're inclined to think of Latin and, say, classical Greek as the really ancient languages. Actually, on the scale of antiquity, they're not. I suppose it's one more example of Western blinkers that we can see only, in what's immediately connected to ourselves. And allied to that is the thing I quoted to you before, that it is the victors who write history. So in the ancient struggle between Romania and the Romans, say up to the time of Trajan, who died in 117 AD, in all that struggle, unfortunately, the Romanians lost out. So the Romans wrote the history. So then it said that Romanian was a Latin language. No, I said to you in that 30 seconds at the end of the last interview, no, it's the other way around. Latin is a Romanian language. And if we want to take back that to its ultimate, now, as I said, we did this interview about a year ago, the end of 2012. Now, last July, 2013, I was really pleased beyond words to see the publication of a huge study that was done by Professor Mark Pagels, P-A-G-E-L-S, at the University of Reading, just north of London. And Mark Pagels and his team, after a colossal amount of work, trying to define the roots of what's technically called the PIE, the Proto-Indo-European language. They managed to isolate the origins of that language, which lies behind all, by the way, languages on Earth, not just the modern European languages. They managed to locate the center of that, where the ice sheets didn't quite come down fully, and that's in Romania and northern Bulgaria. Bulgaria is immediately to the south of your country, at least it was the last time I was there, and that is where the ice sheets didn't come down. So the ancient language, which had come from India in countless centuries prior to 15,000 BC, when the ice sheets started to retreat, the language survived there. And as the ice sheets retreated, the language spread from there, because all traces of humanity had been wiped out across Northern Europe, etc. The ice sheets didn't come down much further than that. So obviously the people who lived in North Africa and that were not much affected by the Ice Age, they continued to live on in very altered circumstances. But anyway, coming back to Professor Pagels' research, he has shown by an exhaustive evaluation of the words that most of the languages in the Northern Hemisphere came from Romania, Bulgaria, and started to spread out from there. So all languages, not just Latin, came from there. And if you go into their research, for example, like even taking the most simple word, they examined, I think, 25 or 6 basic words that have survived. But even take one of the ones that you would expect to survive, like father and mother and me and you. Obviously, those are going to survive. They also found that the word for bark of a tree, survived. They also found other unlikely words to survive, like spit. But of course, if you think, why is spitting so important? Obviously, this is one of the basic things that everyone did. You know, they used bark of trees for clothing, for winding ropes, for covering of houses, etc. They obviously referred to their fathers and their mothers, and they refer to you and me. So those words are bound to survive. They all survive, right back to the source. But if you even take one example, like the word for I, which in English, obviously, it's I. In German, it's ich. In Italian, it's io. In Spanish, it's yo. And in French, it's je. So it's basically the same word. Someone asked me one time, why did so many languages develop on the face of the earth? I said, the reason is bad pronunciation. If someone pronounces the word badly, they spread farther away. They pronounce it even more badly and more badly. Before you know it, you've got a new language due to bad pronunciation of the original. Yes, but anyway, the bottom line is all of this came from Romania, Bulgaria.
Very interesting, because 15,000 years ago there were no cultural traditions and customs. They had to be part of very small families and groups, which later on created larger groups. And as the ice sheet began to withdraw from the land and the forest began to expand over the older desert, semi-desert and steppe areas, the people began to migrate towards the new uncovered territories. But this is why on the present day we have over 60 different languages in Europe.
Right. And, you know, that's, you know, I didn't want the Romanians to get too proud of themselves. But when I said that Romanian is the origin of the Latin language, etc., it's also the origin of culture.
Yes, but what we had 2,000, 3,000 years ago is not the actual Romania and Romanian people. We call them Dacians, and their territory was named Dacia.
Dutch.
I'm very familiar with the Dacian kings, and I am conscious of 2 great heroes in your culture in particular. And sometimes, you know, heroes are thrown into prominence by the force of circumstances. Like your last great hero was thrown into prominence because of having to war with the Romans and war with the Greeks in the time of Alexander, 300 years before the time I'm talking about. The Dacians were cast into conflict with the Alexander the Great's empire, and later with the spread of the Roman Empire. I mean, in the time of Alexander, the Roman Empire was basically just emerging, and it was not the world power that it later became. But what I'm saying is that, you know, your question brought another thing to my mind about the origin of language. And the first point I would make about that is, it seems strange to us today, but back that time in history, 15,000 years ago, about 12,000 BC, the majority of the world's population spoke the same language. Okay, now we have, as you say, 60 languages in Europe, quite correct. But at that time, the majority of the world's population spoke a single language.
Yes, but this is weird, because the language could not be similar to any of the actual over 60 present-day languages, and apparently the fewer people in smaller groups departing from each other should develop more languages than if they were about to form condensed groups. But you are saying that this is the opposite.
Yes, but I'm about to move on from that to draw a conclusion to it, and that is, we are inclined to think that the more spread out from each other people are, the more languages they develop. Whereas anthropologically, the facts seem to indicate that where people are most compressed together is when they start to speak different languages as a means of preserving personal identity. For example, one example that springs directly to mind is the island of Papua New Guinea. There are 800 languages on that small island, which is very densely populated. And speaking a different language is a sort of mental barrier to present as being assimilated into the whole. So it is where people are more compressed together that diversity of languages seem to arise, not when they're more spread out. But I revert back to my point. Yes, around 15,000 years ago, the entire world spoke the same language. It has obviously diverged enormously from that, and you're quite right. What we recognize as modern Romanian or modern Latin, which is, we're speaking, of course, of a couple of thousand years ago, are very different from what was there. But the point is that all language emerged from Romania and northern Bulgaria, and that the various factors that worked for that and so forth, you know, had different influences in different places. But what I'm emphasizing is that when the Latin language came from the Balkans, it was similar to what you would recognize in Romania today, and which turned into Latin. Latin is a recent language, relatively speaking, 2,000, say 400 years in recognizable form. In a real sense, you know, in terms of the classical languages, it's actually a newcomer on the stage. But I'm saying that at that time, 2,400 years ago, leaving aside the 15,000, that the language that migrated southeast and directly west into Rome and so forth was an offshoot of the language spoken in Romania at that time. So not alone did all the modern languages of the Northern Hemisphere come from Romania, Bulgaria, but the more recognizable forms many centuries down since the Ice Age, there's a direct connection between the Romanian of that time and the Latin language. And that's why Romanian is mistakenly called a Latin language. It should be the other way around. Spanish, Italian are Romanian languages. I'm sure that's going to be recognized very soon.
Oh, that's a shock.
But also, as I said, the culture also came. I mean, if you look back on the history of the Dacian kings, it was a highly evolved culture, and it was basically hijacked by others. So
Yes,
it's not just the language; it's the culture has also been taken over.
But this is amazing. When I was on school 40 years ago, unfortunately on the communist regime, we are not told a single bit of this. Do you have any information about the Roman emperor's Thracian Ghetto-Dacian origin? Are there any evidence of the Carpathian Danubian Pontic space as being the home of the old Europe? Because 40 years ago in the communist regime, we are not told the real history. So,
welcome to the club. Welcome to the club. Was any culture ever told the real history? The answer is no. So even though you were not told the real history, that's unfortunate, but it's not exceptional. I think it is the ancestral culture of the whole of Europe, and therefore of every place, say in the Middle Ages of our era, it's the Romania, northern Bulgaria is the ancestor of the culture that spread to dominate the world, you know, in the last 500 years. So I'm asking all the Romanians to step forward and take a large bow.
I thank you very much. Thank you a lot for this presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it. And greetings to all our friends in Romania, a country that's close to my heart. Thank you.